Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday with an emphasis on royalty and historical mysteries. Today on History Calling we've reached the 13th video in my Tudor Monarchs series and the 4th looking at the life of Elizabeth I. The main theme of this video is going to be Elizabeth versus Mary. The Mary in this case is Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and the greatest thorn in her side during the 1570s and up to Mary's death in 1587. Picking up where we left off last week, with Mary a prisoner queen in England, having been ousted from her throne in favour of her son James VI, we'll look at how the relationship between these two women deteriorated to the point that Elizabeth had Mary executed. Alongside this story, we'll also look at Elizabeth's foreign policy and continuing courtships with foreign royals. A quick reminder before we dig in to please subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so you never miss an upload, and to follow me over on Instagram where my username is History Calling. I'll leave a link for that in the description box. And now, let's look at the last major clash between the Tudors and the Stuarts. The year is 1571, and the 28-year-old Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, has been a prisoner of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth Tudor, for 3 years. Already there has been one failed plot by leading English nobleman Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, to marry Mary, retake the Scottish throne, and then eventually the English. But this is just the beginning of Elizabeth's problems with her would-be replacement. Despite some attempts to restore Mary and pressure from the French to do so, for Mary is also Dowager Queen of France, Elizabeth has been unable to find a way to free her cousin which suits her own and Mary's needs and those of little King James VI's council. The English Queen's advisers are very wary of setting the Scottish Queen free, for she has a strong claim to the English throne and is a Catholic. These concerns are not helped by the fact that Elizabeth was excommunicated by Pope Pius V in 1570, and he has declared that she is no queen and that her subjects owe her no allegiance. Elizabeth's council and parliament want to pass stronger anti-Catholic legislation, but Elizabeth blocks it, unwilling to force her Catholic subjects to choose between their monarch and their religion, as Pius hopes to do. As long as they attend Anglican services, she doesn't demand that they take communion. For her part, Mary is increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in restoring her to her throne, and she begins to plot. She joins forces with Roberto Ridolfi, a banker from Florence, who offers to help her by acting as her intermediary with Spain and the Pope. She also allies herself, once again, with the Duke of Norfolk, who Elizabeth has released from the Tower into house arrest with a promise that he won't attempt to marry Mary. Together they hatch a plan to kill Elizabeth and replace her with her cousin. The Queen only discovers what is happening when a letter from Ridolfi is intercepted, but as its recipient is unknown, she doesn't know who in her country is plotting against her. When it emerges that it's Norfolk, he's arrested, placed back in the Tower of London in September 1571, then tried and found guilty of treason in January 1572. Elizabeth dithers over executing him, though, signing and recalling the death warrant over and over again. Mary, for her part, denies everything, despite the evidence of her guilt, and complains when her household is reduced. There are calls from Parliament and Elizabeth's advisers, especially William Cecil, now Lord Burleigh, that Mary be executed, but Elizabeth refuses to kill a fellow monarch. Norfolk isn't so lucky. On the 2nd of June, he's executed on Tower Hill. Ridolfi, however, is safe on the continent, and he lives on until 1612. Elizabeth may not be getting along well with Spain, what with her brother-in-law Philip II contriving to kill her, but on the upside, relations are improving with France. Despite failed marriage negotiations with the Duke of Anjou, the French are angered to find that Mary was conspiring with Philip rather than with them to remove Elizabeth, and pressure from them to release her eases. These improving relations are shattered, however, after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, during which thousands of Protestants, known as Huguenots, are slaughtered in France. Elizabeth's own ambassador, Francis Walsingham, is lucky to get out of Paris alive and shelters some Protestant refugees in his house during the violence. When he gets back to England, the Queen makes him her principal Secretary of State and a member of her Privy Council in 1573. Over the next few years, Elizabeth tries to steer a cautious path when it comes to foreign policy, often infuriating her advisers, such as Burghley and Walsingham, by her reluctance to do more to support foreign Protestants, or even to put her relationship with James VI's council in Scotland on a better footing. She's reluctant to risk drawing the ire of either France or Spain on England, though, always concerned about the economic cost any war or financial assistance rendered to continental Protestants might entail, though in the wake of the massacre she does work on improving Anglo-Spanish relations. As for Mary Queen of Scots, she is reportedly delighted by the St Bartholomew's Day massacre, but less happy when Elizabeth assists in the annihilation of her main supporters in Scotland in 1573. There are still calls from those around Elizabeth to have the Scottish Queen put to death, but she resists. Marriage negotiations for Elizabeth's hand are still occurring in the 1570s, and with the much younger Duke of Alencon, Elizabeth comes close to actually wedding in 1579, only held back by the concerns of her council at the thought of a French consort. She is devastated and enraged, however, when she learns that her great favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, has married her cousin Lettice Knowles the previous year. Though Elizabeth wasn't going to marry him herself, she didn't want him attached to anyone else. She responds to this unwelcome news by threatening to have him locked in the Tower of London, though ultimately relents on this as Leicester hasn't actually committed any crime. His marriage seriously damages their relationship, however, and although it is repaired, it takes 5 years for him to really find his way back into her good graces. His wife is barred from attending court ever again during his lifetime. Elizabeth manages to string Alencon along until 1581, even announcing that November that she will marry him. But when her courtiers react to the news with shock and dismay, she reneges, demanding such unreasonable terms that the marriage negotiations fail. Her one-time fiancé returns to the continent in February 1582 and dies in 1584. Elizabeth's religious policies are further tightened as the reign progresses, with penal laws enacted against Catholics to more heavily fine them if they won't attend Anglican services, and priests imprisoned, tortured and killed. In fact, Elizabeth's biographer, Anne Somerset, has calculated that 183 Catholics were executed during Elizabeth's reign, of which 123 were priests. By 1585, any priest could be tried for treason if he was found in Elizabeth's realm, and anyone helping him also faced death. The Queen may not have had as many Catholics killed as her sister Mary had had Protestants, or used burning as the method, but like Mary, Elizabeth sanctions atrocities against those whose faith differs from hers, and the fact that she doesn't do so as often as during the Marian regime is doubtless of very little comfort to those facing the rack and the noose. But what of Mary Queen of Scots during all of this time? Well, she has continued under a form of honourable house arrest with the Earl and Countess of Shrewsbury. She has a large household to attend her, eats very well, and is allowed to visit places such as Buxton Spa for her health. Nevertheless, she complains that she is hard done by and should have more servants and change houses more frequently. She still hopes for the English throne too, though quite how she thinks that she, as a Catholic, will be permitted by what is now an increasingly Anglican country to hold the crown is anyone's guess. Years go by, however, and Elizabeth shows no signs of dying or freeing her, and so Mary's mind turns more and more to further plotting. Her letters to her French relations asking for help occasionally come to Elizabeth's attention, yet the Queen still doesn't make a move against her cousin, despite this provocation. A plan in the early 1580s to make Mary co-monarch with her son falls apart, and soon a new conspiracy known as the Throckmorton Plot comes to light. In 1583, it's discovered that one Francis Throckmorton is in communication with Mary and the Duke of Guise. The plan was to have England invaded by a French army, Elizabeth deposed and replaced with her cousin. The Spanish ambassador, Bernardino de Mendoza, was in on the whole thing and had assured the conspirators of Spanish support. As a result of the discovery of this conspiracy, Mendoza is kicked out of England in early 1584 and Throckmorton is executed. But Mary, despite her obvious involvement, is still spared, and in fact Elizabeth seems keener than ever to help her and her son reach an accommodation which will allow Mary to be returned to Scotland. James isn't keen on sharing power, however, and ultimately has little loyalty to Mary, who he can't even remember. He tells her as much in 1585, and that's the end of that plan. We now come to the final chapter in the Elizabeth-Mary saga, as Mary turns once again to intrigue. She is now under the custodianship of Sir Amias Powlett, and in order to monitor her correspondence, Francis Walsingham hires a man by the name of Gilbert Gifford to infiltrate Mary's household and the French embassy and act as a courier for letters between the two with the help of some of the Scottish Queen's other servants. Of course, any letters Mary sends or receives go through Walsingham's hands first, where they are decoded, resealed, then sent on. It's through this system that the infamous Babington Plot comes to light. The plot begins in May 1586 with a priest named John Ballard, who plans with Bernardino de Mendoza, now Spain's ambassador to France, to have Elizabeth killed and replaced with Mary. With Mendoza's encouragement, Ballard then goes to England and enlists the help of a young, wealthy Catholic named Anthony Babington. Babington agrees to assist and begins to gather up supporters and decide how to do away with Elizabeth. In July, they write to Mary to inform her of the conspiracy. She replies and consents to the plan. Walsingham has intercepted all of the letters, and he now has proof in her own hand of Mary's intention to have Elizabeth killed. Ballard is arrested on the 4th of August, and though he escapes for a brief period, 10 days later Babington is in custody too. Mary is arrested 2 days after that, and when her belongings are gone through, much incriminating correspondence is found. Her servants are dismissed, and on the 20th of September, Ballard, Babington and their main accomplices are hung, drawn and quartered. Mary is now brought to Fotheringhay Castle on the 25th of September, where she will be tried for her part in the conspiracy. Initially, she refuses to recognise the court's right to try her, given that she is an anointed queen, but she eventually relents and the trial proceeds on the 14th of October. Mary has no legal representative, and so she defends herself. Initially, she denies having written to Babington, though she has to admit to these lies when evidence of her letters is produced. Still, she says she never countenanced Elizabeth's murder, and though her own handwritten letter advocating this course of action cannot be produced because it had to be sent on to Babington after being decoded and he destroyed it, a copy of it, along with the testimony of those who saw it and wrote it out for her, is laid before the court. Elizabeth stalls the trial for 10 days, but eventually, on the 25th of October, Mary is found guilty of the compassing, practising and imagining of Her Majesty's death. Nevertheless, Elizabeth remains highly reluctant to have Mary executed, despite pressure from her council and Parliament. Only on the 4th of December does she allow the death sentence to be formally proclaimed in public, but still she won't sign the death warrant. Her conscience plagues her at the thought of executing another queen, and both Scotland and France exert diplomatic pressure to save Mary's life. Finally, however, on the 1st of February 1587, she is persuaded to sign, and gives orders about how the sentence should be carried out. She still seems uncertain, however, wondering if Mary could be quietly murdered instead, showing that it's more the idea of how Mary is killed rather than whether she is killed which plagues her. But the man to whom she entrusts the warrant, her principal secretary, William Davison, later swears that she verbally consents to the execution again on the 3rd of February. By this point, Burleigh and the Lord Chancellor Thomas Bromley have attached the Great Seal to the warrant, which Elizabeth knows, but she doesn't recall it as she did with the Duke of Norfolk in 1572. On the 4th of February, it is dispatched. 3 days later, at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary is informed that she will be executed the next day at 8 a.m. She spends her last night writing a letter to the King of France, completing her will, and dividing up her belongings amongst her remaining servants. The following morning, she is taken to a scaffold which has been erected in the castle's great hall. Refusing the ministrations of the Protestant minister supplied, she forgives her executioner and his assistant, as is customary, and allows her 2 ladies and the executioners to remove her outer black dress to reveal a crimson petticoat, red being the colour of martyrdom in the Catholic Church. She is blindfolded and lays her head on the block. Her last words are in Latin and translate to, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." It takes 2 blows of the axe, followed by some sawing, and yes, that is as disgusting as it sounds, to remove her head. When the executioner lifts it up, it then falls away from his hand as Mary was wearing a wig. Her lips continue to move for 15 minutes after her death, and apparently her pet dog runs out from beneath her skirts. but everything from her clothing to the block itself is destroyed by fire straight away to prevent relic hunters looking for something stained by her blood. Mary herself is buried in a Protestant service in Peterborough Cathedral, though not until July. Her son later moves her remains to Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth now has to deal with the fallout from what has happened, and she has perhaps the worst fit of rage of her entire reign. Upon learning of Mary's death on the 9th of February, she blames everyone but herself for what has occurred, and insists that she had never wanted the death warrant enacted and had only signed it in case of some future emergency. She temporarily stops eating and sleeping, has Davison thrown into the Tower of London as a scapegoat, and mulls over whether she can have him summarily executed. In the end, he is heavily fined and imprisoned for a year and a half, though the fine is never paid and his salary as secretary continues. Burghley is refused the Queen's presence and is in disgrace until the summer. France and Scotland are in uproar that the sentence has been carried out, and Elizabeth worries that James VI might declare war on her, though these concerns do not come to pass. So what should we make of this entire episode? Elizabeth certainly put on a good show about not having wanted Mary dead, but for me, her words after the event ring a little hollow. While she undoubtedly had scruples about executing her cousin, to my mind, when you're the Queen of 16th century England and you sign a person's death warrant, you need to expect them to end up dead. She didn't recall the warrant when she had the chance, though she had plenty of time, and her talk of having Mary murdered, the insinuation being that her death could then be passed off as natural, combined with her comparatively lenient treatment of Davison in the end, suggests that she may have planned things this way all along, so that she could use his supposed disobedience to excuse her actions to the French and Scottish. But while we might doubt her protestations of innocence, can we fault Elizabeth for having Mary killed? Mary had been involved in conspiracy after conspiracy to have Elizabeth murdered and seize her throne, and would have been dead herself much sooner had the English Queen not constantly intervened to save her from the ire of the English Parliament, Privy Council, and much of the populace. Some would argue that Mary ultimately brought this on herself. For those who thought that the greatest threat to Elizabeth's life and reign was now cold in her grave, there was a nasty shock on the horizon. For far from Scotland declaring war on its neighbour, it was Spain and Philip II that were the biggest hazard. For political and religious reasons, Philip had long desired Elizabeth's overthrow and death, not helped by the fact that English pirates, or privateers if we're being polite, including the famous Sir Francis Drake, had been ransacking Spanish ships for the past few years with Elizabeth's connivance and funneling much of the money they seized to the Queen. The year after the axe fell on Mary's head, Elizabeth would face the greatest crisis of her reign, the Spanish Armada. Make sure you come back next week to hear how she dealt with this threat to her crown and her life, and in the meantime, let me know below if you believe she was right to execute Mary or if she should have continued to hold her in confinement, and do you think that Mary was the author of her own misfortunes? If you'd like another Tudor fix right away, check out my Tudor Monarchs and Six Wives of Henry VIII playlists, which are linked on screen and in the description box. Or for something different, try my video on the mystery of Skeleton Lake. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.